It's Always Been You. Written by Just Thinking Drabbles. Read by Arashi. Hubert had never cared much for gifts, whether it was receiving them or giving them. He really only gives one to Edelgard every year for her birthday, and he had no idea what to do with himself when she would give him one for his own in return. And the presents, while practical in most cases, were not something he particularly needed. Sure, it was nice to have a new dagger, or an extra pair of gloves for when his original pair got destroyed during some of his more gruesome spy work, but he could buy such things on any given day. He didn't quite understand the idea of special occasions and being given something simply because you cared. He had never been taught such things. The heirs of House Vestra were servants first and foremost, and were trained merely to give, not to receive. That's when White Day came around, he was not expecting to receive anything from Ferdinand. Of course, he had given him something for Valentine's Day, just a few chocolates that he had picked up in the market, and he thought he might enjoy, but it meant very little in the grand scheme of things. Though Hubert often denied it, there was truth to the fact that Ferdinand was very popular with the other students at Garreg Mach, and had received several gifts that day, many of them from far more suitable people than Hubert believed himself to be. He hadn't even given it to Ferdinand in person. Instead, he had simply left it in front of his dorm room, with a small note that had nothing on it but the rushed scribble of his name. No, Hubert was certain that his appalling gift would not be reciprocated. It was more likely that it had been thrown out after having been found than anything else. He wasn't upset by the fact, though. Not at all. He didn't even care for the Ire heir anyways. Not in that way, at least. Maybe not at all. Or that's what he told himself anyways. In truth, he wasn't quite sure how he felt towards his fellow classmate. Did he love him? Hate him? Perhaps it was a mixture of both, though he supposed it didn't really matter in the end. Whatever his feelings were, Ferdinand was not likely to feel the same were he to discover them as romantic. Still, he couldn't keep himself from wondering how Ferdinand felt as he sat in the dining hall and picked idly at his plate of grilled herring. It was not one of his favorite meals, and it did little to draw his attention away from the thoughts spinning around in his mind. Yet he was drawn away from them completely when he caught the sight of Ferdinand passing through the room. He looked as pristine as ever, with his clothes fresh and free of wrinkles, and an overly cheery grin on his face as he approached one of the knights. Yet something was different about him, something that Hubert couldn't quite place at first, but once he saw it, he couldn't get it off his mind. There was a clip in Ferdinand's hair that was holding back his bangs. It was small, and less ostentatious than most things the noble had ever worn, but the way it held back his bangs and revealed his beautiful amber eyes made Hubert's heartbeat begin to race rapidly. His first thought, as he fell prey to the sight of his wavy, bright strands of hair, glowing in the even sunlight, was that he looked absolutely breathtaking, almost angelically so. His next thought, however, was far more grim and ugly, as it dug its claws into his chest and plucked at his heartstrings. Who had given it to him? Had it been a gift from Valentine's Day? Did he intend to wear it as he gave the gifter his own present? Was he going to confess his love to them? Ferdinand appeared to be holding something too, something that looked rather similar to a bag of chocolates, as well as a large bouquet of flowers. This made him even more nervous, as the thoughts continued to spin in circles through Hubert's mind as he watched him, his green eyes narrowing as he tried in vain to catch even a fragment of what he was discussing with the knight as he gripped tightly to his fork. He didn't even notice he was doing it until Caspar came up to him and patted him a bit too harshly on the back. "You okay, Hubert? You look like you're ready to snap that fork in half." Reluctantly, Hubert turned his gaze to him and placed the fork on the table. "Fine," he murmured. "I'm fine. I'm just a little tired." And truthfully, he was always tired, so it wasn't necessarily untrue. Caspar sat across from him and began to talk with him, but Hubert paid him no mind, as he turned his head back to where Ferdinand had been. But to his dismay, the nobleman was gone. A gnawing feeling started aching within his stomach. Had he gone to confess to someone? Without really thinking it through, he excused himself from the table and swiftly left the dining hall. He wasn't sure why, but he wanted to find Ferdinand, to know if the hair clip truly was a gift from an admirer, and to know if he had feelings for said gifter. It wasn't his business, really, but Hubert wanted to know. He needed to. So he went after him, following in the shadows, as he often did, and waited for Ferdinand to give someone his gift. The first person that Ferdinand met with, as he travelled through the monastery, was Sylvain. They were meeting for tea in one of the gardens, which often seemed to be an appropriate place for couples to confess their feelings. Hubert's heart beat loudly in his chest as he watched them exchange pleasantries from his place behind one of the bushes not too far away. He kept waiting for the moment that Ferdinand would give him the flowers and chocolate and confess his feelings for the man, but it seemed as though they were simply talking. Sylvain was still Sylvain, of course, and gave him his usual flirtatious winks and soft smiles, even casually wrapping his arm around his neck at one point. Even so, Hubert's fists still clenched at his sides. He could feel the sparks of dark magic forming at his fingertips, but he took a deep breath to try and force the urge away. It would be quite noticeable if the heir to the Gautier line had gone missing suddenly, and Hubert really didn't want to deal with that. He watched them take a seat at the table and poured themselves some tea. As they did, they chattered about little things, none of which Hubert found particularly important, or interesting for that matter. Turns out, Sylvain was almost as fond of horses as Ferdinand was. It seemed that the gift at Ferdinand's side wasn't even on his mind as he sat with Sylvain. The flowers and chocolates were even laying there in plain sight, and he seemed to have no intention of acknowledging their presence. Hubert was perplexed. If Sylvain was not the intended recipient, then who was? Had he divulged such information to the Gautier heir? And, if so, would it be possible to question the man after they had finished with their tea time? Perhaps he had told some of their other classmates about the identity of his crush, and it made him wonder who might be worth asking. Casually, of course, so that no one would catch on to his own feelings. Time passed far too slowly, as he waited for the two of them to finally finish their tea time, and Hubert only realized they were done when the scrape of their chairs against the stone snapped him out of his sleepy state. They gave their goodbyes, and Ferdinand carried on his way, the box of chocolates and flowers still in hand. The flowers themselves were red roses, if Hubert recalled hearing once, stood for something like love in the language of flowers. He couldn't be sure that Ferdinand had bought those specifically for the meaning, but knowing him, he wouldn't put it past him. He liked to be dramatic, after all. He started following him through the halls, in aimless wandering for a while, and Hubert started to wonder if he even knew where he was headed next. Perhaps he was unsure of where to find the object of his affection. How silly, Hubert thought. Was he to simply follow him around on a wild goose chase all day, until he could finally discover who it was that Ferdinand was confessing to? He groaned, and ran his fingers through his messy head of black tendrils. This was going to be a long day. Throughout the day, Hubert watched the series of Ferdinand's encounters, and his ire and irritation rose with each time that he carried on his way, with gifts still in hand. Among the list was many of the Black Eagles, some who Hubert could have seen the man potentially having a fancy for, and others who he found didn't sit right with him when he had approached, especially when he had walked up to Edelgard. His heart had fallen into the pit of his stomach with that particular conversation, and it remained there until Hubert finally saw him walk away. Though, if he was being honest with himself, none of the possible candidates sat right with him. They weren't a good fit, and they would not make him happy. Not that Hubert had spent much of his time wondering what would bring him joy. However, he knew Ferdinand well, and he liked to think that, despite their constant habit of fighting, he still knew much about the man, and what might be beneficial for him. Ferdinand needed someone strong and dependable, who wouldn't sleep at all hours of the day, or shout his ears off at unnecessary moments, who could fight by his side and protect him, but also hold him when he was feeling down, and kiss away his fears. Someone who shared many of his viewpoints, but who would challenge him on the ones they didn't agree on, and laugh about it later. Someone who also enjoyed taking a break for tea with him, even if tea was not what he would be drinking. He? He was startled from his thoughts when he realized his mistake. He sighed, hoping vainly that it might whisk away the ideas of him ever having a chance with Ferdinand, and brought his attention back to the man in question. He was talking with Hilda now, though he appeared to be more disheartened than he had in previous conversations. Could it be that she was the one he admired? Was she turning him down? His heart ached to see the saddened look crossing his face. He looked something like a hurt puppy, and Hubert couldn't bear to see it. When Hilda walked away, Ferdinand was still left with the flowers and chocolates in his hands, and his mood had become increasingly melancholy. The urge to comfort him overwhelmed him, and before he knew what he was doing, Hubert's feet began to move on their own. He marched towards him with confident footfalls, his heartbeat fastening, despite his intentions being purely platonic, or whatever it was that he and Ferdinand considered themselves at present. At the very least, if only when admitting it to himself, he considered him and the nobleman to be friends. He would rather die than say so aloud, though, so instead he merely stopped behind him and cleared his throat, causing him to whirl around in surprise. His eyes were a tad startled, but a spark of joy flashed through them when he met Hubert's gaze. Curious. Most people found him towering over them to be frightening, and more often than not, Ferdinand found it to be infuriating. Yet today, there seemed to be no trace of such things, and the sincerity of it all scared him a little. "Something wrong, Aya?" he said, because of course he couldn't just say hello. "Hubert!" Ferdinand replied, his tone chipper. "Ah, not really. Not now, anyways. I had been looking for someone. You, in fact. And now, here you are." Hubert's entire body stiffened, and he felt suddenly breathless. Me? He had been looking for me? Impossible. I must have heard him wrong. He did his best to rationalize the situation, but the more fabrications his mind began to spin, the more Ferdinand unraveled them as he continued to talk. "It is silly, I know, but, well, I wanted to give these to you." He extended the flowers and chocolates towards him, but Hubert could do nothing but blink. I know you don't like sweet things, but I managed to make some chocolates that taste like coffee, with Mercedes's help. I didn't think it would be enough, though, so I also got you these flowers." Hubert still remained silent, as he was unsure of how to respond. Ferdinand liked him too? How was that possible? He worried it might be a dream, or perhaps even a vicious prank. Yet Ferdinand looked almost hurt at him not responding, perhaps taking his quiet stare for a rejection, and he started to pull away. Hubert panicked. "Why?" he asked. His tone came out more biting than he had meant it to. He winced and cursed himself for being so harsh. Well, you gave me a gift for Valentine's, and I wanted to reciprocate. Oh, is that the only reason? Hubert shouldn't have felt as hurt as he did, so Ferdinand didn't return his feelings. It wasn't that big of a deal. He would get over it. They were better off as friends anyways. But then he heard Ferdinand speak once again, his voice soft and hesitant, and Hubert's heart began to race once again. It is certainly a reason, but it is not the only one. He felt hopeful once again, but he tried desperately to quell it until he had all the answers he wanted. What about the hair clip? Is that not some sort of gift from an admirer? What? Ferdinand raised a brow curiously, before his hand reached to touch the clip that Hubert was referring to. This is something from Bernadetta. She noticed that my hair was falling into my face during class, and offered to let me borrow it. Oh. His face heated at the realization. He was beginning to feel rather foolish indeed. Ferdinand chuckled, and then looked up at Hubert, his amber eyes brimming with fiery confidence, the same kind that often prevailed during their many arguments. I love you, Hubert von Vestra. I want you to be with me, if you will have me, that is. Hubert shook his head, a fond smile forming on his face, as he took the gifts from Ferdinand's hands. He still couldn't believe this was happening, but he wasn't going to waste any more time wondering about the ifs and whys. Honestly, Ferdinand, you can be so very dense sometimes. And before Ferdinand could rebut him, he closed the distance between them with a soft and loving kiss.